Jovan Buha! Buha!
Yo, I'm Jovan Buha, Lakers beat writer for The Athletic, and welcome to episode 43 of Buha's Block. On today's episode, we are going to be doing a Lakers mailbag. It's been a few weeks since I've done a mailbag, so it felt like I was overdue. And there is a lot to touch on, but also not a lot of updates. We will get into it. I am still here in Las Vegas. If you could not tell, I'm still in my hotel. This is day 6 in Las Vegas for me. And it's been a lot of fun, a lot of late nights, a lot of networking, and just all the madness that comes with being in Las Vegas and being at the epicenter of the NBA universe. But before we get started, you guys know the drill. For those on YouTube, please be sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment and like if you enjoy this video. And then for those on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast platform of choice, please be sure to follow, download, and leave a 5-star review. All right, first question from @LakersSupply. Any significant updates on the trade front? Talks heating up, more of the same as before. Most execs typically leave Vegas after the first weekend, correct? Well, that is correct. That the busiest weekend of Summer League is always that first weekend. That is when everyone is in town and people start to trickle out during this upcoming week and then into the weekend. And executives and coaches and stuff will stay around for the teams that advance in Summer League. But for the most part, that initial wave of activity is that first weekend or so. And it's been quiet across the league. If you look at what has actually happened over the last few days, outside of the Jalen Brunson extension, there's not been much going on. And there's a significant holding pattern right now because of the Lauri Markkanen situation and to a lesser extent, the Brandon Ingram situation. But with regard to the Lakers, there is not much to update. As I just reported this morning for The Athletic, the Lakers are taking an approach of patience and don't want to make a move just to make a move and don't want to give up unnecessary draft capital or a player and make a move in a position lacking leverage, and them potentially waiting later into the summer or even into the season would give them some additional leverage, and depending on what happens with other teams. Like right now, most teams are optimistic about their potential for next season for the most part, but that could change depending on injuries, depending on underperformance, and depending on several other factors that go into whether a team is good or not, whether a team is successful or not. And so my sense from this weekend and talking to dozens of people, Lakers team personnel, rival personnel, coaches, scouts, agents, all of those people I have pulled with some form of what's going on with the Lakers? What have you heard about the Lakers? What do you think of the Lakers? And for the most part, everything has just been quiet. And once they did not make an initial move in terms of doing a salary dump, they kind of missed that initial wave of moves and activity. And right now, there's just a bit of a holding pattern in the league with the dominoes with Lauri and Brandon Ingram. So again, my understanding is the Lakers have been aggressive in terms of conversations and trying to make moves, but the feedback that they've gotten, the asking prices that they've gotten for certain guys, be it a first-round pick for certain players that they don't feel are worth a first-round pick, or even 2 first-round picks for certain players that they might feel are worth no first-round picks, or maybe 1 first-round pick. That is what has led to this stagnancy. And I think some of this traces back to the Russell Westbrook situation and how disastrous that was ultimately. And if you look at the Lakers' moves and really their history since then, they have been more cautious and conservative with making trades in general, but also with using draft capital in their trades. So once they made the Dalton Connect pick and now only have 2 first-round picks to trade, they're 2029 and 2031. They do have multiple swaps and they do have multiple seconds, but they have been reluctant to include both first-round picks in trades. And they felt that most of the players that have been out there, be it a Jeremy Grant, a Wendell Carter Jr. is a name that has recently popped up, or a Cam Johnson, a Kyle Kuzma, Dorian Finney-Smith, that none of those guys have quite reached the level of warranting 2 first-round picks, and even in some cases, 1 first-round pick. Those Lakers picks are very valuable. LeBron James is going to be 45 in 2029. Anthony Davis is going to be 36, and then 38 in 2031. So there is a chance that the Lakers, depending on how the rest of the decade goes and whether they can find that next star to lead the franchise. I mean, first, be the sidekick or the co-leader with Anthony Davis, but then take over the franchise into the next era. Until they find that guy, there is no assurance that they're going to be good or even average by the end of the decade. So those picks are valuable. Those picks have value to the Lakers. And they're trying to strike that balance, however delicate and however difficult it is, of maintaining some of their flexibility and assets for the future while also building a contender in the short term. And they think in part adding a guy like Dalton Connect, bringing in JJ Redick to replace Darvin Ham, that there's going to be a level of growth just with those couple of moves alone. Now, I think that the rest of the West has gotten better, and you look at what OKC's doing, you look at Denver and Dallas and Minnesota, and I think it's going to be hard for the Lakers to jump any of those teams, let alone the Warriors, who I think probably got better after losing Klay Thompson. The Rockets are on the rise. The Grizzlies should have a bounce back season. The Kings got better with DeRozan. The Pelicans got better with DeJounte Murray. So the West is deep. The West is loaded. But while I understand the patience and the prudence on their part, I also think that at some point you have to make a move if you are trying to win a championship now. You have to make a move if you are trying to go all in the short term. And they've been trying to strike that balance of, if the right move isn't there, we're going to be patient and wait this out until training camp, until the season, until the trade deadline. And time will tell if maybe a better move pops up, a player becomes available, a team lowers their asking price for player X, and maybe the Lakers figure something out. But as of right now, they are at a standstill, and it does not seem like there's any significant traction toward any type of deal anytime soon. Next question from @Jord Santiago. With the Lakers' quiet offseason, how much of it is they still believe in this roster, and how much of it is there's no more fair deal out there yet and they need to wait it out? So expanding on my previous answer, I believe it is the latter and not the former. Though if you believe in actions and you believe in actions speak louder than words, the Lakers did not make a move at the 2024 trade deadline, and they have not made a move of significance this summer. So they can say publicly that they are going for it, that they believe in this core, that they believe in LeBron and AD, and they're just a little bit healthier, even though their top 4 players were pretty much as healthy as is realistically possible in the modern NBA, and that those factors, add in JJ instead of Darvin Ham, and that those things would lead to a better season. And while I agree with that, I do think the rest of the West is getting better. And OKC was already the 1 seed, and they added Alex Caruso and Isaiah Hartenstein. Minnesota is going to be getting better, and they added a top 10 pick in Rob Dillingham. Dallas should be getting better with guys like Derek Lively and PJ Washington continuing to grow. Daniel Gafford, they added Klay Thompson, they added Najee Marshall. Then you look at a team like Denver, they're going to take a step back in theory, losing KCP. So that is a blow to them. But they were already, I think for most people, they were the favorite last year, or the co-favorite, or right there at number 2 behind Boston. So I still think, even with losing KCP, it is a significant loss for Denver, but they still have Nikola Jokic, they still have Jamal Murray, they still have Aaron Gordon, they still have MPJ, they still have Michael Malone. I still think they're going to be really good. They might not be as good as they were before. They might not be the best team in the West, or the best team on the West on paper, but they're still there, and I still have them ahead of the Lakers. And you just go down the list, and it's several teams have made notable moves. I think, again, that my understanding and my sense in talking to people within the team and around the league is that the Lakers are trying to be patient and not make a move just to make a move, and not make a short-sighted decision that affects their future flexibility and affects their ability to improve this roster in a meaningful way, either later in the summer or closer to training camp or the start of the season or even into the season. So they are trying to balance improving the roster with a longer term view in terms of making sure they are maximizing their one or two at bats at actually improving this roster. But at the same time, actions can speak louder than words, and the actions of them actually going for it have not really been there, at least from a public perspective. And they could have made a move at the 2024 trade deadline. They could have made a move up to this point this summer. Maybe it wouldn't have been the home run that certain fans want, or maybe that the team wants. Maybe it wouldn't be the sexy addition that certain fans want or that the team wants. But if you have picks, you can use them, and you can use salary to improve the roster. So from that perspective, I don't necessarily agree with the argument or the notion that they couldn't do anything, that that there was nothing to do. I don't fully believe that. I don't subscribe to that theory, right? So I think that there's always something to do when you have draft capital. And for the Lakers, I mentioned specifically draft capital because the players that are trying to trade don't have a lot of trade value. As I've said on here multiple times, guys like D'Angelo Russell and Jared Vanderbilt, Gabe Vincent, Rui Hachimura, they have somewhere between neutral to negative trade value across the league. And there are certain teams that have interest in maybe one of those guys, but there are very few, if any, teams that have interest in multiple of those guys. And that's ultimately been why the Lakers have been not able to find a deal. And then you have these draft picks that have a lot of value, but everyone's going to want at least one, if not both. And then you also don't have the roster flexibility to take on more contracts because you have a full roster. So the Lakers, they're in a tricky position. I think the first thing has to be making a consolidation trade to open up some roster flexibility, both with roster spots and with their actual just being under the tax and creating some breathing room there. But I think it's really going to come down to how aggressive are they willing to be with the draft capital. And they say if the perfect trade is out there, or if a trade that elevates them to a certain level is out there. But you could also use that as an excuse to not make a move and to then retroactively justify it and just say, well, hey, the perfect move wasn't out there. The perfect player wasn't out there. A player that didn't rise to our standards to elevate this team just wasn't out there. And I get that perspective to an extent, but I also think if you put those two picks on the table, you're going to get something, and you're going to get something good. And now again, do you potentially have to overpay for a certain player? Potentially. But if you also look at it from the perspective of I may be attaching a pick to a couple of these contracts that I don't necessarily want, and then I'm also paying a second pick to get a contract that I want or a player that I want, I think it becomes a little bit more palatable from that perspective. But again, I don't think the Lakers should do a move just to do a move. I know there are some fans that think that, but at the same time, I think you could easily fall into excuses and justifications as to why you haven't made a move. So it's a tricky situation. And I mean, clearly, it seems like there's not going to be a move anytime soon, unless it's maybe a consolidation trade that precedes a bigger move or them potentially signing someone. But outside of that, it seems like they've had a really high standard for actually moving those picks, which you should, because you don't want to just give them away willy-nilly. But at the same time, I think at some point it comes down to, if you wait too long, you could miss your window. And now all of a sudden, they're potentially entering the season with this roster. And while it's a good roster, it is still a flawed roster. And there's no guarantees that they end up finding that deal that they've been looking for. So I think at some point, you got to bite the bullet. You got to rip the Band-Aid off, and you just got to make a move and go for it. And I think there are names that have been out there that I think could be Lakers if they were willing to put those two picks on the table. And as of right now, that just has not been the case. Next question from @FirstRowLakeShow. What is the more likely outcome at this point? Lakers open roster spots through trading multiple players for one, or salary dumping? So this one is a bit tricky. My understanding is the most likely outcome between these two would be the Lakers doing some sort of consolidation trade, say a Cam Reddish and a Christian Wood, or a Cam Reddish and a Jackson Hayes, and then add a second round pick or even two, and you could protect those picks and make it so it's unlikely that they convey, but some sort of draft capital, in it being second round picks, with those players to a team with cap space, be it a Detroit, a Utah, or a team with some open roster spots, a team with some financial flexibility that could take those guys on and then potentially waive them or reroute them in a separate deal. That, from my understanding, is the more likely outcome between these two, because the other form of trade you're talking about is basically let's say it's Portland, for example, and it's like a Rui Hachimura, a Gabe Vincent, and a JHS for a Jeremy Grant. That's a way you open up two roster spots, and that's a 3-for-1 trade. But Portland has to be willing to take on the additional salaries and the additional roster spots, and they have to then figure out their cap sheet and their roster situation. So between those two, I think the more likely outcome, just because it's like that's also going to cost you at least a first round pick, if not two. And it remains to be seen if the Lakers would be ultimately willing to pay that kind of price for a guy like a Jeremy Grant. But between the two, the most likely first move is a smaller consolidation trade that opens up a roster spot or two, and then potentially a bigger trade at some point. But given the current state of the trade market and given the Lakers' reluctance to give up their picks, specifically their first round picks, I would look at the second round picks and a consolidation trade as more likely. Next question from @Garrett Garcia. Hey Yovan, love the show. Want to get your opinion on what you think the Lakers' most realistic trade option is this offseason. Maybe an example of one blockbuster deal and one smaller one. Thanks. Thank you, Garrett. I appreciate the support. I think this comes down to what you deem a blockbuster deal, because Donovan Mitchell is off the board. Trae Young is likely off the board. Zach LaVine, the Lakers have not had interest in him, and he has a negative trade market right now. DeJounte Murray is off the board now that he is in New Orleans. DeMar DeRozan is off the board now that he's in Sacramento. So the Lakers have run out of guys that I would consider like blockbuster type players, like Mikal Bridges also is now in New York. So if you consider a Jeremy Grant or a Kyle Kuzma as a blockbuster type player, I think those are realistic guys that the Lakers could land, depending on the structure of the trade and how many picks they're willing to put in. And then on the smaller scale, I think a guy like a Cam Johnson or a Dorian Finney-Smith, and likely one first round pick in those potential deals, like that would be a smaller type deal that the Lakers could execute. So I think it like you could argue that all of those types of players are more smaller scale type deals, and I wouldn't fight you on that classification. So right now, like a blockbuster deal seems, I just don't see it. Like I don't see them having enough for Lauri Markkanen. I have not heard of any interest with Brandon Ingram, so I don't see them going for those two guys, and that's all stuff I've talked about before. But in terms of the names that have been out there, you could throw Wendell Carter in. I don't know if that's a blockbuster or if that's a smaller one. So like Bruce Brown Jr. Like it gets to a point where I think all these guys are for the most part like starter level, high role player type guys, and they are good, and I think they can improve the roster depending on what the trade looks like and what the draft capital going out is. But I think for the Lakers, like at this point, it's a lot of those names have been the names that have been floated out there for the last week, 2 weeks, few weeks. The Lakers have some options here, and I think again a consolidation trade at some point, be it in the short term or maybe closer to the beginning of training camp, is sometime over the next couple months is the most likely scenario here. But it could also be a bigger trade. It's just I don't know if any of these names quite rise to the level of a blockbuster. Next question from Only in Dreams 81. Can the Lakers come into training camp with a starting backcourt of DLo and AR, knowing full well of their defensive liabilities, which AD will have to cover up again? This, to me, is the biggest reason why the Lakers should not enter the season with this roster and why they ultimately have to split up this backcourt and make some type of move and I've reported this, like the Lakers are aware of the limitations of the Austin Reeves, D'Angelo Russell backcourt. And they have made it very clear that they value and prioritize Austin Reeves, who is the younger player and the player on the team-friendly multi-year contract. So they tried to trade D'Angelo Russell last season. They have tried to trade him this offseason. So I still think the Lakers will trade D'Angelo Russell at some point, but is that going to be in the next few days, in the next few weeks, in the next few months? That part is not as clear. But if the Lakers are serious about winning a championship, that cannot be your starting backcourt. And if you look at the other starting backcourts of teams with contenders, they have better two-way talent. They have better defenders in the backcourt. I just think it's a really tricky fit defensively. And just having another defender, even if it's a Gabe Vincent, who can take on the primary assignment in the backcourt and alleviate some of that defensive burden on Austin Reeves and allow him to be a bigger part of the offense and focus more on the offensive end. Like I think that's just key for the Lakers and balancing out this roster, which has been a term that JJ Redick has used multiple times. I think it's not just the backcourt fit of Austin and DLo defensively, but then you look at if Rui is starting and some of his defensive limitations, guarding wings and chasing guys off the ball and around screens. And then LeBron James, who on some nights during the regular season is just going to take nights off defensively because he's about to be 40 and because of all the mileage and the recent injuries that he's had over the last few years. Like that's a lot on Anthony Davis to shoulder defensively. And that's the reason why you could have arguably the best defender in the league and still have a bottom 10 defense when you look at the types of players that are surrounding him. So I think the Lakers, like ideally, this is where they make a trade for a better defensive wing and that player can start next to LeBron and AD. But then also they trade or rearrange the rotation to have a better starting backcourt player defensively next to Austin Reeves. So this, again, it's not so much a criticism of D'Angelo Russell as it is just the fit of D'Angelo Russell and Austin Reeves. The Lakers have made it clear that they value and will prioritize Austin ahead of D'Lo. And with that reality and just the understanding that D'Lo is going to be the guy that gets moved if one of those two gets moved, then it comes back to, what type of player would fit better next to Austin Reeves. And I think it's a guy who can take on those primary defensive assignments in addition to another wing that can also take on those primary defensive assignments. And you add a better point guard defender and you add a better wing defender. And all of a sudden, I think the Lakers have a better balance offensively. And the defense can also be at least around league average, if not better, depending on the caliber of defenders that they end up adding. Next question from @Dalboys805. What is one thing you want Reeves, Rui, and Vando to bring into their game next year, in parentheses, assuming they're here? This is a fun question. For Austin, I think it is becoming a better three-point shooter and catch-and-shoot player. I think if he can elevate to a high 30s or even low 40s more consistently, that just elevates his game to another level. And it shrinks some of the gap that there was last season between him and D'Lo offensively. Like obviously, D'Lo is a really good passer. And you saw that with the way that he ran the offense, and you saw that with his assist totals and the way that he affected the Lakers from a plus-minus perspective. But another big part of that was just his catch-and-shoot numbers and his three-point shooting. So I think if Austin can become a better catch-and-shoot threat and spot-up threat and three-point shooter, I think that will do wonders for his game offensively. I think defensively, if he can also find that balance of I think we saw a stark difference between his defense the first half of the season and his defense the second half of the season. And the first half of the season, he was coming off Team USA. He was battling some lower leg injuries and wear and tear and different things. So part of it just comes down to health and rest and recovery and all that stuff. So I think he will enter next season in a better situation in terms of his defense from the beginning of the year, but just finding a better offense-defense balance and the two sides not taking away from his game as much as they did at various points last season, where it felt like sometimes when he was giving more defensively, he wasn't the same player offensively, and when he was giving more offensively, he wasn't the same player defensively. So I think just finding a better two-way balance for him would be a key. For Rui, I think it's playing with a sense of force and aggression and focus more consistently. And I think overall he did a better job in the regular season than he did in the prior regular season for that stretch. Like, I think people forget before the 2023 playoffs, Rui was a DNP CD. There's that game in, I believe it was late March, early April against the Bulls at home, where Darvin ends up benching him and just not playing him. And it was a message to Rui of like, you really need to lock in and focus. And that was part of the reason why he didn't start last season as the starter. And I thought that, eventually once he became the starter, like he remedied a lot of the things that were criticisms from the coaching staff and internal criticisms. And like the Lakers went 22-10 to finish the season, and they put themselves in position to be a playoff team and potentially go on a run had they not matched up with Denver. But then in that Denver series, he had a really rough series and was missing open threes and missing box outs and defensive coverages and was missing layups and dunks and just was not playing like himself. So I think Rui's focus and aggression and consistency, if he could be more consistent and locked in and engaged and play with a certain level of motor and aggression and force, I just think with him, he has the physical tools, he has the skill, he has the talent. It's just about putting it together consistently. And if he can do that, I think he can be a starter or a very high level bench player consistently on a really good team. And then with Vando, it's as simple as just him becoming a competent catch and shoot threat. And if he could even get to like 32, 33% consistently as a spot up shooter, I think that would do wonders for his playability. And I'm not even saying league average. I'm not saying 35, 36, 37%. I'm saying 32, 33, like 34 would be great. So Vando becoming a better catch and shoot guy, and then also playing with a level of confidence and assertiveness offensively. And you saw that the final 2 to 3 weeks before he got injured, where the Lakers started to use him more as a dribble handoff guy and as a cutter and really in the middle of the floor and leveraging some of his ball handling, his playmaking, his cutting, his finishing. And he's got skills. Like, this was a guy who was a point forward and had shown some guard skills coming up during his basketball career. So I think like Vando has more skill than sometimes is depicted with him. And I think if the Lakers, if JJ can learn from some of the successful ways that Darvin used Vando right before the injury, and JJ can implement some of those and then fine tune them and just make some tweaks. Like, I think there's a path to Vando being a useful starter, but it really has to come with the offensive growth and he and the Lakers making teams pay for guarding him the way that they typically guard him. Next question from @BallotBatman. Hi, Jovan, subscribers since your first post on YouTube. Could we have your thoughts on the front office's priority of a serviceable big man first before any moves other than getting rid of our vet minimum players? This touches on one of the more frequent questions I get. A lot of fans want a better big man than Jackson Hayes and then Christian Wood. This is something that JJ Redick touched on Friday when he did an interview with SiriusXM NBA radio, and he talked about the Lakers going after a bigger, tougher, more physical center and not being able to get that player, but that is still a need for them in order to better balance out their roster. And just with the state of the West right now, and OKC and Dallas and Denver and Memphis and like some of these bigger, Minnesota, like some of these bigger teams, you need multiple big bodies and you need guys who are tough and physical and can protect the rim and are defensive minded. And that's not Christian Wood, and that's not Jackson Hayes. Christian Wood is a really good defensive rebounder, and he can help in lineups specifically with AD. But the Lakers don't have that type of center that can hold the fort down when AD is off the floor. Like, Christian Wood is good with AD, but you can only play him so much with AD, and you still need that center that can play without AD and at least hold their own, tread water to some extent. So the Lakers still need that player. And my understanding, I mean, JJ said it publicly, like they have gone after that player. Jonas Valanciunas was someone that they tried to go after, and he comes with a lot of defensive concerns. If anything, offensively, I would have loved the fit with him and just his ability to post up, his shooting touch, And he's still a good offensive player. It's really the defense and his inability to defend pick and rolls and just his lack of mobility, I think would have made him a bit of a tough fit from the defensive side. But just having a guy like that, I guess, if you could move AD out of pick and rolls and have him as the backline guy, like maybe you could get away with it because AD is so great. So Lakers are going to need to find this type of big man. I don't see that big man being out there in free agency. It's probably going to have to be a player that they go out and get in a trade, and maybe they do one of these trades for one of these wings and they're able to rope in a big man. Like if they go and get a Cam Johnson or a Dorian Finney-Smith, can they also get a Day'Ron Sharpe? Like if they go and get a Jeremy Grant, could they also get a Robert Williams in that trade? So I think there are ways to lump in a big man. I mean, you could also go and try and get a Wendell Carter Jr., though the asking price has been high from Orlando. So like there are ways for them to go and get that type of player. But one thing that I think needs to be said with all this is that Anthony Davis remains a 5. And yes, it would be nice to find a big man that can push him to the 4. But ideally that player has some level of shooting. Otherwise you are messing up the spacing. And that's kind of always been the issue is, like that's at least Christian Wood, though he is not a plus defender, had a measure of shooting and didn't really translate last year. Like he was not a good shooter for the Lakers. I think he shot like 31% on threes, but in theory, he's a stretch 5. He's a floor spacing 5. He's a pick and pop big. So you kind of need a guy who could space the floor and also just be serviceable defensively while having a certain level of height, having a certain level of defensibility, a certain level of toughness, physicality, strength, force, like all these things. So like it's a specific type of player and it's a difficult player to find. And when you're also looking at you potentially have to upgrade the wing spot. And then if you are trading D'Angelo Russell, you're going to have a hole at guard. And now you want to bring in at least a backup caliber guard to help with the ball handling and the playmaking. Like you start to have other holes in the roster pop up that are potentially more important or just as important. So I think this is a need and this is a big need. And ideally this would have been a need. Like they could have signed an Andre Drummond with the taxpayer MLE or they could have found a bargain big and say, hey, you're going to be our primary guy. But this also comes back to the player options and them giving player options to Cam Reddish and Christian Wood and Jackson Hayes and that coming back to bite them because those would have been roster spots that they could have used for better players or better fitting players. So I think this is a need for sure. And my understanding is, again, like it's on their to-do list, but they're also looking at these wings that can space the floor and can also defend multiple positions. And it seems like that has been the greater emphasis for them over the last few weeks. But if that's 1A, this is 1B, or if that's 1, this is 2 right there in terms of getting another backup, solid backup center who's good defensively. And those guys are tough to, like every team could use one of those guys. So it's a tough guy to acquire. And especially if you are getting a wing on top of that, that's almost certainly going to require at least both first round picks, if not a pick swap or some seconds. Like you're going to have to invest draft capital in that type of trade. So it remains to be seen if the Lakers can find that guy. I've seen a lot of names. I haven't loved many of the names, but a guy like Robert Williams, I think would be great. If you could find a way to like 2 picks for Jeremy Grant and Robert Williams, I would be interested in that personally. I've not gotten a great sense as to how the Lakers would feel about that, but like that's the type of deal that you kill 2 birds with 1 stone. But I don't know if that's how realistic that is, where Portland's at with that. I've more so heard just like the Jeremy Grant interest and asking price. So, but certainly a better defensive center. Like I've said, that's my number 2 need for them. And I still think that remains as they have these 2 more offensive minded bigs and 2 bigs who are on the slender kind of slight side. Next question from @Brian3386. How do you think Cam Johnson would fit on the Lakers? I think Cam Johnson would fit very well. He is an elite shooter. If you look at from a volume perspective, he's been in that 5 to 6 threes per game range for multiple years now. He's often been a 40+% 3-point shooter. So from a shooting perspective, he would elevate the roster and immediately be contending with Dalton Connect for best shooter on the team. And you could also throw D'Angelo Russell into that, though he might have to be in this hypothetical deal with Brooklyn. But Cam Johnson, I think, would fit really well offensively. He is an underrated playmaker. If you look at his assist percentage, and his assists have upticked in Brooklyn. He's a decent rebounder, not a good rebounder, but decent. Defensively, I think there are some questions. I wouldn't consider him a wing stopper. He's got good length, and I think he can use it well in certain matchups. And he is relatively quick and athletic for his size, but he's not like some crazy wing stopper. So he's not I think you're doing it more for the offense and the ability to space the floor and just be a high level shooter and shot maker for this Lakers team, and playing off of LeBron and AD and Austin and potentially D'Lo. So I think he would fit well. My two big concerns with him are injuries. If you look at the last few years, he's dealt with several injuries that have cut his seasons short, and he does have a mounting track record of injuries. And then it is the defensive end. I think he could help and be an upgrade over Rui, but he's obviously a downgrade from Vando. And I just think he's not quite at the level that they need, and not quite at the level of a Dorian Finney-Smith or a locked-in Jeremy Grant, even a locked-in Kyle Kuzma. So compared to some of the other guys, I think he's a step down defensively, but certainly the best shooter of that bunch, and would elevate the Lakers offense, I think, just with his shooting and his ability to play off the ball. At David_D_Kim, subscriber here, how much of a leap do you think Max will take after we decided to let Torian walk? I think Max is going to take a significant leap. I think he's going to be the Lakers' eighth man. If you look at, let's just say the starting lineup is AD, LeBron, Rui, Austin, D'Lo, and then I'd put Gabe and Vando as the sixth and seventh men in some order. I think Max is right there at number 8. And depending on how Dalton Knecht continues to grow and develop and play in summer league and play into training camp and the preseason, maybe he ultimately becomes the 8th man. But for now, the Lakers invested heavily in Max Christie with that 4-year, $32 million deal. And I believe you don't invest that type of money in a player unless you're going to play them and give them a certain role. So right now, I would pencil him in as the 8th guy, as that backup 2/3, depending on the matchup, depending on the night. And I think he's someone that is going to, if I had to project out what his stat line looks like, it's probably something like 8 to 10 points a night, 4 to 5 rebounds a night, a couple of assists a night, maybe a steal to a steal and a half, depending on how much he's actually playing, and solid percentages. I could see mid to high 40s in terms of field goal percentage. I would say high 30s with 3-point percentage. And his free throw percentage oddly dropped last year by almost 10%. So I could see him going back to being a low to mid 80s free throw shooter. So you add that all up, and that could be a productive bench wing. And I think that's in line with Max Christie, with the flashes that he's shown, with how much the Lakers believe in him, how much they're trying to invest in him and develop him and give him an opportunity next season. And I would not be surprised if those are his averages and he's playing somewhere in the 22 to 26 minute a night range. So I think the ceiling is high with Max, and I could be even underselling his potential or his potential role. But I just think if he's given an opportunity, and all indications are he's going to be given an opportunity, I think he's going to make the most of it. I think he's a player who is going to play better with more consistency and more confidence from the coaching staff. And all of that is going to lead to potentially a breakout season for him, again, depending on where he ultimately falls in the pecking order, what the rest of the roster looks like. If the Lakers make a trade for a Kyle Kuzma, Jeremy Grant, that's also going to alter potentially how many minutes Max Christie is playing. If they're getting rid of D'Lo and Gabe, all of a sudden there are more backcourt minutes. But if they're keeping one of those guys and then maybe adding a couple wings or something, then it can be a little cramped. Or if Dalton Knecht outperforms expectations, maybe Max ends up being the 9th or 10th guy. So there are various ways that this can all play out. But as of now, I'm penciling him in as the 8th guy. I think the Lakers are really going to need his spot up shooting, his ability to attack from the weak side, and his perimeter defense, especially guarding either backcourt spot and maybe even some threes. Next question from @MoisesXLove. Not a Lakers question, but who are you rooting for in the Olympics when Puerto Rico plays Serbia in basketball? This is a really tough question. For context, I am half Puerto Rican and half Serbian. My mom is from Puerto Rico. My dad is from Serbia. So this is like the group of death for me, where you have Puerto Rico, Serbia, and the US all in the same bracket in the Olympics. So I can't win and I can't lose, depending on how you look at it. But between Serbia and Puerto Rico, for me, it's just like, it's kind of like Mama Kelsey having her sons in the Super Bowl and having the Eagles going up against the Chiefs. It's like I'm removing myself. I'm wearing the jersey split down the middle of half Puerto Rico, half Serbia, and just, removing myself from the situation, just letting the game happen, and whoever wins. I mean, if we're being honest, I think Serbia would win that matchup. I think they're arguably the second best team in the Olympics, and they're going to be a strong contender for a medal. But I mean, crazier things have happened. Puerto Rico has beaten the US in group play before, so certainly within the realm of possibility. I just I just imagine my mom's reaction and my dad's reaction, and I know he's much more calm and laid back. She's much more animated and passionate. So I know she's going to be rooting hard for Puerto Rico and hoping they pull it off. So for me, it's a win-win either way. It's also a lose-lose either way, but I'm just going to sit back and enjoy that game and enjoy whichever way it ends up going. Next question from @tent_training. What is your favorite soda? So I included this because I like these personal questions. And if you guys have questions for me outside of the Lakers, outside of the NBA, outside of journalism, just more personal questions, I would love to answer them and share a little bit more about myself and get to know some of you better, and see some of you guys comment and answer some of these questions in the comment section on YouTube. So I wanted to, when I see questions like this in the past, I might have not included them just because they weren't Lakers related or even basketball related, but I'm trying to connect more on a personal level and share a bit more about me. So in terms of my favorite soda all time, it's cream soda. I think it is the best soda. I love all things vanilla and cream and any dessert or sweet with a variation of that. I will always love vanilla and cream and all those things. But in terms of what I will drink on not necessarily a daily basis, but maybe on a weekly basis, certainly a Diet Coke or a Coke Zero. At this point, I've tried to cut out as much sugar as I possibly can, but I do like the kick of getting some caffeine and just the taste of it. So for me, it's typically a Diet Coke, but I will have a Coke Zero if that's the only option, or sometimes just to kind of switch it up. Certainly Diet Coke and Coke Zero above Diet Pepsi. There's a distinction there. So for me right now, it's going to be Diet Coke. Next question from @Dagger3. What's the status of JHS? What kind of role or archetype do we hope he fills? Right now, JHS is still recovering from his back procedure that he had that ended his season prematurely. So he's still in the process of coming back. And my understanding is he's expected to make a full recovery at some point, but obviously it's not a great sign that he is not back and playing for Summer League. I think this would have been a very valuable opportunity for him to show out and potentially boost his trade value from the Lakers side, but also just, with guys like Cam Whitmore and Jaime Jaquez and Brandon Pajemski playing really well in Summer League, Jaquez and Pajemski also playing with the Team USA select team. There continues to be the picks after JHS, that continues to be a sore spot for the Lakers and kind of continually rubbed in their face that how good those guys are. And obviously those guys made all rookie teams and stuff. So for the Lakers, I think it would have been nice to have JHS play and play well. That's ultimately not going to be the case. But for him, in terms of his player archetype, I think the upside now is probably a third guard who has a certain level of size and physicality and athleticism. He's a legit 6'4", 6'5". He does have broad shoulders. I still think he needs to figure out the best way to use his body and his physicality at the NBA level. The shooting needs to improve. The defense needs to improve. He did show some promising flashes in the G League, and he had some monster games. And you look at his G League numbers and you compare it to his NBA numbers and the player that we saw in garbage time, and it's a night and day difference. So he still has a ways to go in terms of translating his development and his growth at the G League level to the NBA level and carving out a role. But I think if we're looking at like the upside and what he could be and what he was meant to be, I think he's something of a combo guard who could be a plus defender off the bench and sort of like that third or fourth guard. But that's probably looking at his ceiling now based on what we've seen from him over the past year. And he still needs to show a lot of growth in terms of his decision-making offensively, his shooting, his defense, and just his overall confidence. I think the biggest thing he lacked at the NBA level was a sense of confidence. So if all those things start to progress in a positive way, I could see JHS becoming a rotation player at some point down the road. Probably not this season, maybe next season or the season after that. Who knows if he's a Laker the rest of the season or the next season or whatever. So there's a lot of unknown variables with JHS, but I think the outline of what he could be is like an athletic guard with a shaky jumper, but he makes up for it by getting downhill, playmaking for others, and defending and using his size at like that point guard spot. But at this point, it's looking more like if he hits his ceiling, it's probably as a bench player and more of like a mid to back end rotation player. But it's still, I know there's a lot of pessimism with JHS, and I mean, I had concerns with him. You could ask people that have covered the team. Like I've had concerns with him since last summer league. I think from the beginning, his shot selection and his performance, there are several red flags for me personally, but I still think at his age, it's just too early to give up on him in terms of like what he could be. But so far, there's not been a lot of positivity in terms of like what we've seen at the NBA level. It's primarily been his pedigree as a prospect and then what he's shown in the G League. So still a ways to go in terms of him becoming a potential rotation player. But I also don't want to entirely write him off the way that some people have, just because there is a reason why the Lakers believed in him at number 17. And while he's probably not going to warrant that selection in comparison with some of the guys that went after him, I still think he has a chance to eventually become a rotation player, depending on how the next couple of years go with his development and with his health. And final question from @HoosierMama. How do you feel about the Pete news? For those who are unaware, Pete Zayas, aka Laker Film Room, and the host of the Laker Film Room podcast, along with Darius Soriano and formerly Mike Trudell, he dropped a bombshell on Sunday night announcing that he is leaving the Lakers. He is going back to being an independent podcaster and creator. And he laid out, essentially, he got a slap on the wrist for his coverage of the Dan Hurley situation. He called it a saga, and the Lakers did not like that. And they basically gave him the choice to either continue podcasting, but leave the Lakers, or stay with the Lakers and stop podcasting. And he chose to continue podcasting and go independent and leave his dream job, his dream team, the team that's been his life for decades at this point. So my thoughts on this, it's a tough situation, right? Because if I had a podcast talking about The Athletic and the inner workings of it and analyzing it, like I'm sure at some point I would say something that one of my bosses would not like, and I would get a slap on the wrist and I would have a conversation, and would probably lead to this. Like it's one of the tricky things with being an employee of an organization and then having a podcast about the organization. Like at some level it gets a bit tricky. And now look, like I listen to the Laker Film Room podcast. It's one of my favorite podcasts. I think they do a great job. I've known Pete for years. I've known Darius for years. I've known Mike for years. I've broken bread with all of them. I've texted with all of them at various times. So like on a human level, I'm rooting for them. I'm rooting for their success. I also understand like it's just it's a tough situation for the Lakers where you have an employee talking about the organization, and sometimes it's not always going to be positive just because of the nature of podcasting and talking about a team as objectively as possible. And I think they thread the line about as artfully as possible. And there were several other things that, like, I was surprised that was the final thing that was the thing that got them in trouble to the point of having to choose between the podcast and employment. I thought there's been other things that they've talked about that they've been more critical on, or other things that have been a bit more controversial. So I was surprised at like what the final straw was. But in terms of like having a podcast talking about the organization you work for, like, again, if I was talking about The Athletic, or if you were talking, if any of you watching this or listening to this had a podcast about the company or organization that you work for. If you work for one, maybe you're independent or you're an entrepreneur or whatever. But if you work for a company and you had a podcast for them, it's a tricky thing where at some point you're probably going to run into a roadblock or a hurdle. So I get from the Lakers side why they maybe haven't been always happy with certain things that have been said. But I also get it from Pete's side and from their side with the podcast of like, this is something they've been doing for years. This is something that they've grown into, one of the best podcasts in the Lakers space and some of the best basketball analysis, period. I think it's like, yes, it's Lakers focused, but when they touch on other things, like they do a great job. So I think like I get it from both sides to an extent. I was surprised though that the Dan Hurley stuff was what ultimately did it in, just because again, I think they've been more critical in other regards in other episodes, but maybe that was just the final straw for whatever reason. I don't agree with it, but I think that this could end up being a blessing for them as now they are back to being independent. They can say whatever they want without a filter. And I also think it's a great thing for Laker fans because now you have Pete speaking freely and making a video like the Dalton Connect video that he just made that you should all check out. So like, I think him being able to be unfiltered and go on his rants and just speak without repercussions or overstepping a line, like I think that's just going to be great for Laker fans to have really smart analysis, but also have it unfiltered and completely independent now. So go check out Laker Film Room. Go check it out on all platforms. Go check it out on YouTube. Support the show. Support Pete. Support Darius. It sucks that Mike isn't going to be a part of it anymore, but obviously that was going to be a tough situation for him if they were going independent. And part of it was that he was obviously a Lakers employee, and Pete was a Lakers employee, and then I'm not sure with Darius if he was freelance or contractor or what, but it's tough. Again, like just if you're doing a podcast about the company you work for, I think inevitably you're going to ruffle some feathers. And that was always the delicate balance with the situation. But it's a great podcast. They are great at it. I could not recommend it enough. It's one of my, again, favorite podcasts to listen to. And I'm excited to hear and see where they take things in the future. But that will do it for today's episode. For those watching on YouTube, please be sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment and a like if you enjoyed this video. Also, if you have a mailbag question, drop a comment below. Let me know your thoughts on some of my answers, and also ask me a question if you have one. And then for those listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast platform of choice, please be sure to follow, download, and leave a 5-star review. I'll be back later in the week. Before then, if something happens of note, but I will be back later in the week, tentatively with a special guest. I think you're going to enjoy the episode. I will not spoil it, but I think you're going to enjoy this one. So be on the lookout for that, and I will talk to you soon.